What would you do if, in the middle of dinner with your entire family, your parents declared that you had no rights at all, only to watch the verdict that followed strip them of everything instead? Before we dive in, drop a comment where you're listening from and hit that like button because this is one of those family battles you'll never forget. My name is Emily Carter, and at 32 years old, I thought I'd seen the worst my family could throw at me. I was wrong. The mahogany dining table at my parents' estate in Bellevue, just outside Seattle, had witnessed countless family gatherings over the years. But that October evening, as rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, it would become the stage for my complete disinheritance, or so they thought. I'd arrived at 7:30 p.m. sharp, as always. My mother, Linda, insisted on punctuality with the fervor of someone who believed tardiness was a moral failing. The house smelled of rosemary lamb and expensive wine, the kind of carefully orchestrated ambiance my mother deployed like armor against the world's judgment. "Emily's here," my brother Daniel announced from his position at our father's right hand, barely glancing up from his phone. His wife, Victoria, offered me a smile that never quite reached her eyes, the same practiced expression she'd worn since marrying into our family 5 years ago. I took my usual seat, the one I'd occupied since childhood, facing the portrait of my late grandmother. Her painted eyes seemed to follow me as I settled in, and I found myself wishing, not for the first time, that she was still here to temper my parents' increasingly cold calculations. "Now that everyone's present," my father, Mark Carter, began, setting down his wine glass with deliberate precision. "Your mother and I have something important to discuss." The atmosphere shifted. Daniel straightened, suddenly interested. Victoria's fingers found his under the table. My mother's expression hardened into something I'd seen before, the look she wore when firing household staff or cutting ties with friends who'd fallen from social grace. "We've been reviewing our estate planning," my mother said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false concern she'd perfected over decades of country club politics. "And we've come to some difficult decisions about the family's future." I set down my fork, the lamb suddenly tasteless in my mouth. "What kind of decisions?" My father cleared his throat, a sound that had preceded every major disappointment in my life. "Emily, you've chosen a path that diverges significantly from this family's values and expectations." "You mean because I'm an interior designer instead of joining the family real estate empire?" I kept my voice level, though my hands trembled slightly beneath the table. "It's more than that," my mother interjected. "It's about commitment to family legacy. Daniel has shown that commitment. He's expanded our holdings by 40% in the last 3 years. Victoria has been invaluable in maintaining our social connections. And I've built a successful design firm from nothing," I countered. "My clients include half of Seattle's tech executives." "Personal achievements," my father said dismissively, "not family achievements." Daniel finally looked up from his phone, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "What they're trying to say, Emily, is that you've made your choice. You wanted independence? You've got it." The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. I looked from face to face, searching for some sign this was an elaborate joke, a test, anything but what I was beginning to understand. "Let me be clear," my father said, his voice taking on the crisp authority he used in boardrooms. "As of tonight, you have no rights to any family assets, no claim to inheritance, no stake in any family properties or businesses. You are, financially speaking, no longer a Carter in any meaningful way." The room seemed to tilt. Through the roaring in my ears, I heard my mother add, "We've already had the papers drawn up. Richard Blake handled everything personally." Richard Blake, Daniel's best friend from law school, now conveniently the family's attorney. "This is illegal," I managed to say. "You can't just—" "We can, and we have." My mother cut me off. "You're 32 years old, Emily. You've made your own way, as you're so fond of reminding us. Now you can continue doing so without any expectations or obligations to this family's wealth." Victoria's smile had widened, no longer bothering to hide her satisfaction. Daniel was already back on his phone, probably calculating his doubled inheritance. I stood slowly, my legs surprisingly steady. Every instinct screamed at me to rage, to throw wine in their faces, to flip the table that had hosted my birthday dinners and holiday celebrations. Instead, I looked each of them in the eye, memorizing their expressions of cold satisfaction and petty triumph. "I see," I said quietly. "Thank you for making things so clear." My mother's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps expecting tears or pleading. My father nodded, apparently pleased by what he took as acceptance. As I walked toward the door, my grandmother's portrait caught my eye one last time. In that painted gaze, I swore I saw something encouragement that made me pause. "One question," I said, turning back to face them. "When you planned this ambush, did you consider that grandmother's original will might supersede your schemes?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. My mother's face went pale. My father's jaw clenched. That was the moment I knew if I didn't fight back, they would bury me forever. The drive back to my Capitol Hill apartment that night was a blur of rain and brake lights, but my mind was sharp, cutting through memories like a scalpel through flesh. To understand why my parents believed they could simply erase me, you need to understand the Carson family hierarchy and my place at its bottom. I was 8 years old when I first realized I was the wrong kind of daughter. It was Christmas morning, and Daniel had just unwrapped his gift, a junior executive briefcase with his initials embossed in gold. I'd received watercolors. "Daniel will carry on the Carter legacy," my father had said, ruffling my brother's hair. "Emily can make things pretty." The dismissal in those words had shaped everything that followed. While Daniel attended private dinners with potential investors at age 16, I was relegated to the kitchen with my grandmother, learning her Serbian recipes and listening to stories about the old country. My parents saw this as proof of my unsuitability for business. They never knew that grandmother was teaching me more than cooking. She was telling me about the properties she'd bought with her own money, investments my parents didn't even know existed. "Your mother thinks I'm just a foolish old woman," grandmother would say, kneading dough with surprisingly strong hands. "Let her think that. The foolish ones are those who underestimate the women in this family." By the time I turned 18, the family dynamic was set in stone. Daniel was enrolled at Wharton for business. I'd been accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design, and my parents' disappointment was palpable. "Art school," my mother had said, pronouncing it like a disease. Well, I suppose someone needs to marry well, but I didn't marry Weller at all. Instead, I graduated summa cum laude, apprenticed with 3 renowned designers in New York, and returned to Seattle to build my own firm. Every success I achieved seemed to deepen my parents' resentment. When Seattle Magazine featured me in their 30 Under 30 issue, my mother's only comment was, "They must have had a slow news month." The real fracture came 3 years ago. Our family owned a craftsman house in Wallingford, my grandmother's first American home, purchased in 1962 with money she'd saved working double shifts at the factory. It needed renovation, and I'd spent months creating restoration plans that would preserve its historical character while modernizing the infrastructure. I'd done it out of love, staying up until 3 a.m., researching period-appropriate fixtures and tracking down original blueprints from the city archives. The night before I was to present my plans, I overheard my parents on a conference call with Daniel. They were selling the house to a developer who planned to demolish it and build condos. Emily's little project was how my father described my work. The buyer was one of Daniel's contacts, and the commission would fund his expansion into commercial real estate. "What about Emily?" I heard my mother ask. "She's been working on this for months." "She'll understand it's business," Daniel had replied. "Besides, she's too emotional about these things. We need someone who can make rational decisions." They sold it the next day. I found out when the demolition notice was posted. 6 weeks later, I watched from across the street as they tore down the house where my grandmother had planted her first American garden. where she'd raised my father, where she'd taught me that strength could be quiet and power could be patient. But the cruelest betrayal had come just last year. My grandmother had left me her jewelry collection when she died, not expensive pieces, but items with history. A locket from Belgrade, a ring her mother had hidden during the war, prayer beads blessed by an Orthodox priest. They were stored in my parents' safe, waiting for what my mother called an appropriate time for me to claim them. One afternoon, I arrived at the house to find an estate sale appraiser cataloging items in the study. Among them were my grandmother's pieces, tagged and priced. "These are mine," I'd said, reaching for the locket. "Actually," my mother had said, appearing in the doorway, "they're family assets, and the family needs liquidity for Daniel's new venture." "A crypto startup," Daniel had added, as if that justified selling our grandmother's history. "It's going to revolutionize real estate transactions." The startup failed within 6 months. My grandmother's jewelry paid for Daniel's Tesla and a vacation to Turks and Caicos to decompress from the stress. Each betrayal had been a lesson I wasn't family. I was an inconvenience. My successes were embarrassments that highlighted Daniel's failures. My independence was a threat to their narrative of family unity. And now, at this dinner, they'd finally made it official. But sitting in my apartment that night, looking at the single photo I had of my grandmother, one my parents didn't know existed, taken at her naturalization ceremony, I realized something. They'd been so busy erasing me from the family that they'd forgotten to ask why grandmother had spent so much time with the child they'd deemed worthless. "The foolish ones," I whispered to her photograph, "are those who underestimate the women in this family." She'd been right then. And as I pulled out my laptop to search for every property record, every trust document, every legal filing with the Carter name on it, I knew she was right now. My parents had just made their biggest mistake. They'd declared war on someone who'd been preparing for this battle since she was 8 years old. The email had arrived 3 days before the dinner, at 11:47 p.m., on a Tuesday. I'd been reviewing fabric samples for a Mercer Island project when my phone buzzed with a notification from an address I didn't recognize. Truth Witness, 9962@protonmail.com. The message was brief. "They're going to destroy you completely at Thursday's dinner. Be prepared. A friend." I'd dismissed it as spam initially. Maybe a competitor trying to rattle me before a big presentation. But something about the specificity Thursday's dinner had lodged in my mind like a splinter. My parents had invited me just that morning, an unusually formal request for what they'd called an important family discussion. Now, sitting in my apartment with the taste of betrayal still bitter in my mouth, I pulled up the email again. The date 1962 was the year my grandmother had arrived in America. Coincidence. In this family, I'd learned nothing was coincidental. The dinner itself had been orchestrated with theatrical precision. I realized that now, replaying every moment. The seating arrangement that isolated me from potential allies. The timing right after I'd landed a contract to redesign the governor's mansion library. My biggest commission yet. Even the menu had been calculated lamb, my grandmother's signature dish, as if they were erasing her memory along with my inheritance. But it was Aunt Margaret's behavior that haunted me most. My father's younger sister had been uncharacteristically silent throughout the meal, her hands trembling slightly as she'd pushed food around her plate. When our eyes met as I was leaving, I saw something I recognized: guilt mixed with fear. Margaret had always been the family outlier, a high school principal who'd chosen education over empire building. She lived modestly in Ballard, driving a 10-year-old Honda while my parents collected European luxury cars. "Money makes people cruel," she'd told me once at a cousin's wedding. "Our family has too much of it." At 2:15 a.m., unable to sleep, I decided to drive past Margaret's house. Her kitchen light was on, unusual for someone who religiously went to bed at 10 p.m. on school nights. I parked down the street, debating whether to knock, when my phone buzzed. "I see you outside. Come in through the back. Don't let anyone see you." The text was from Margaret. I found her in the kitchen, looking older than her 58 years, clutching a mug of tea like a lifeline. The table was covered in documents, old photographs, legal papers, newspaper clippings. "I knew you'd come," she said without preamble. "You always were too smart to take their cruelty lying down. You knew what they were planning." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "They made me witness the paperwork. Said if I didn't sign, they'd invoke some clause about mental incompetence, claim I wasn't fit to manage my own affairs. Your brother has power of attorney documentation with my signature forged, but try proving that against Richard Blake." "Why warn me?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "That wasn't me, though I wish I'd had the courage." She pulled out a faded photograph my grandmother standing with another woman outside a courthouse. "Recognize her?" I looked closer. The other woman was younger, professionally dressed, holding a briefcase with the initials G.H. visible. "Grace Holloway," Margaret said. "Your grandmother's lawyer. She handled things, quietly, things your parents never knew about. She's senior partner at Holloway and Associates now, 73 years old and sharp as ever. I think she sent that email." "But how would she know?" "Because I called her." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "After Mark and Linda strong-armed me into witnessing their scheme, I thought Grace should know what they were doing to Helena's granddaughter." Helena. My grandmother's real name, the one she'd used before America anglicized her into Helen. "There's more," Margaret continued, pulling out a manila envelope. "The night before she died, your grandmother gave me this. Said to keep it safe until you needed it. I think that time is now." Inside was a USB drive and a single sheet of paper in my grandmother's handwriting, "For Emily, when the wolves show their teeth." "What's on it?" "I don't know. She said only you should see it first." "But Emily," Margaret gripped my hand, "your parents aren't just cruel, they're desperate. The real estate empire is hemorrhaging money. Daniel's failed ventures have cost them millions. They need your inheritance, the one they don't think you know about, to stay afloat." "What inheritance?" Margaret smiled for the first time that night. "Your grandmother wasn't just making stuffed cabbage in that kitchen. She was building a shadow portfolio, properties, investments, accounts they know nothing about. All legally structured to bypass them entirely." The room seemed to spin. "How much? Enough that they're willing to destroy their own daughter to get it." I plugged the USB into Margaret's laptop. It required a password. I tried several combinations before remembering something my grandmother used to say in Serbian, "Istina će izaći na videlo." The truth will come to light. The drive opened. What I found there changed everything audio recordings. Dozens of them. My grandmother had been recording conversations for years. My parents discussing tax evasion, Daniel bribing city officials, Richard Blake proposing illegal property transfers, and at the very end, a video message from my grandmother herself, dated just a week before her death. "My dearest Emily, if you're watching this, then they've finally shown you who they really are. Good. Now you can show them who you are. The documents you need are with Grace. The evidence is here. Use both wisely. And remember, the foolish ones are those who underestimate the women in this family." Margaret was crying quietly. She knew. She always knew what they were. Then why didn't she stop them earlier? "Because," Margaret said, "she was waiting for them to commit, to go so far they couldn't walk it back. Tonight, they did exactly that." As I drove home with the USB in my pocket, Seattle's skyline blinking in the distance, I finally understood the email's signature truth witness. Tai 62. My grandmother had been witness to truths since the day she'd arrived in this country. Now it was my turn to reveal them. The following evening, I waited until 11:30 p.m. before returning to my parents' house. They were at a charity gala. I'd seen the photos on Instagram. My mother resplendent in diamonds, my father glad-handing potential investors. Daniel and Victoria were there too, playing the perfect heir and his sophisticated wife. The house would be empty except for the night security, and I still had my key and oversight they'd soon regret. I knew my father's study better than he realized. As a child, I'd hidden behind the leather sofa during his business calls, learning the rhythm of his deceptions. The filing cabinet was locked, but the combination hadn't changed in 20 years my parents' anniversary date, a touch of sentiment in their otherwise calculated lives. The third drawer held what I was looking for, a folder marked Estate Planning, Confidential. My hands shook as I photographed each page with my phone. The documents were worse than I'd imagined. The transfer agreement was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. On the surface, it appeared to be a simple family trust restructuring. But buried in subsection after subsection was the trap, a forced disinheritance clause that would trigger the moment I voluntarily acknowledged having no claim to family assets. Tonight's dinner had been designed to provoke exactly that acknowledgement, with witnesses present, but they'd made an error. The document referenced all Carter family holdings as documented in Schedule A. Schedule A was missing. I searched deeper and found more. A contract with Richard Blake's firm dated 6 months ago, outlining the strategy to legally minimize Emily Carter's participation in family assets. The retainer fee was staggering $200,000, paid from my grandmother's estate. My stomach turned. They'd used my grandmother's money to pay for my disinheritance. In a hidden folder behind the others, I discovered the real prize correspondence between my father and Daniel about property transfers. They'd been moving assets between shell companies, creating a paper trail so complex it would take years to untangle unless you knew where to look. One email stood out, dated 3 weeks ago. Once Emily is out, we can liquidate her portion to cover the Riverside development losses. Blake says if we move fast enough, she won't have grounds to contest. The old woman's properties can be folded in without probate notice. The old woman? Even in death, they couldn't speak my grandmother's name with respect. My phone buzzed. A security alert: someone had triggered the driveway sensor. They were home early. I quickly photographed the last crucial document, a transfer deed for properties I didn't recognize. Addresses in Spokane and Tacoma, dated the day before my grandmother's death, but not filed until last week. Footsteps in the hallway. I closed the cabinet, spun the lock, and slipped behind the heavy curtains just as the study door opened. Told you the Hendersons were insufferable. My mother's voice, slurred with wine, acting like their donation makes them royalty. We need their money, my father replied. At least until the Emily situation resolves. How long before she realizes she has no legal recourse? This was Daniel, his voice carrying that particular smugness I'd grown to despise. Blake says if she hasn't contested within 30 days of tonight's acknowledgement, we're clear. The recordings from dinner will prove she understood and accepted the terms. Recordings. They'd recorded the dinner, and if she finds out about the Spokane properties, Victoria's voice, unexpectedly. She won't, my father said firmly. Helena was careful, but not careful enough. We found those deeds in her safe deposit box. Emily doesn't even know that box existed. They stayed for another 20 minutes, dissecting the gala, planning their next moves. I remained frozen behind the curtain, my legs cramping, breathing in shallow, silent breaths. Finally, they left, and I heard their bedroom doors close upstairs. I waited another hour before slipping out through the French doors in the study, the same ones my grandmother used to leave open on summer evenings. The motion sensors in the garden had been broken for months, another oversight my parents would regret. Back in my car, I reviewed what I'd photographed. The Spokane properties were the key, 3 addresses, all in industrial areas. Why would my grandmother own warehouses 2 hours from Seattle I called information, got the numbers for property management companies in Spokane, and left messages with my business card information? Someone would know something. At 3:45 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed a Spokane area code. Miss Carter, this is Tom Briggs from Briggs Property Management. I've been expecting your call for 5 years. 5 years. Your grandmother said you'd contact me eventually. She was very specific. When Emily calls about the warehouses, tell her to look in Unit 17. I've been maintaining them, paying taxes from the rent proceeds as instructed. Clean books, all documented. Your parents tried to claim them last week, but the ownership structure requires your signature. They need my signature. Your grandmother was brilliant. Miss Carter. Those properties are held in a trust that can't be dissolved without unanimous consent from all heirs. And you, specifically, were named as co-trustee with rights of first refusal. I felt a smile spread across my face, the first genuine smile since dinner. Mr. Briggs, what exactly is in Unit 17? I don't know, ma'am. She said only you should open it. But I can tell you this, she visited it every month for 20 years, always alone, always carrying boxes in, but never taking anything out. My grandmother, the woman my parents dismissed as a simple Serbian immigrant, had been playing a longer game than any of them imagined. Mr. Briggs, I'll be there tomorrow afternoon. Please have all the documentation ready. Already prepared, Miss Carter. Like I said, I've been expecting you. As dawn broke over Seattle, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, the USB drive, and pages of notes. The pieces were falling into place. My parents had built their trap carefully, but they'd built it on a foundation they didn't fully understand my grandmother's empire, hidden in plain sight. They thought they'd stolen my inheritance. In reality, they'd just revealed their own crimes, and Unit 17 was about to reveal everything else. Margaret's apartment felt like a sanctuary when I arrived at 7A. Exhausted but wired from the night's discoveries. She was already dressed for school, but called in sick the moment she saw my face. You found something, she said. Not a question. I spread everything on her kitchen table, the photographed documents, my notes from the Spokane call, and the USB drive. I need to know what you're not telling me about your situation with them. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured coffee. It started 3 years ago. I owned a piece of land in Snoqualmie, inherited from our mother. Just 5 acres, but developers were circling. Mark came to me with an investment opportunity, said if I sold and put the money into Daniel's fund, I'd triple my investment within a year. You said no. I said I'd think about it. The next week, I received legal papers. Daniel had somehow gotten himself listed as my healthcare proxy from a form I'd signed during a routine surgery years earlier. They'd altered it, added financial power of attorney. Richard Blake notarized it. That's fraud. Try proving it. Blake had 2 witnesses swear I was of sound mind when I signed, both employees at Daniel's company. She pulled out a thick folder from a kitchen drawer. I've been documenting everything since then. Every threat, every forged document, every manipulated contract. Why didn't you go to the police? With what proof they own half the city council? Blake plays golf with the district attorney. And she paused, shame coloring her features. They have something on me? I waited. 20 years ago, I had a relationship with a married woman. She was getting divorced, but the papers weren't final. Your parents have photos, love letters. They've threatened to send them to the school board, to parents. It would end my career. Margaret, that's blackmail. And it's 2024, no one would care. In Seattle proper? Maybe not. But I work in a conservative district. 3 board members are evangelical conservatives. They're already looking for reasons to push out experienced teachers. She met my eyes. But I'm done being afraid. Your grandmother wouldn't forgive me if I let them destroy you too. She handed me the folder and a second USB drive. Everything's here. Including recordings I made of Mark threatening me. Washington's a 2-party consent state, but I stopped caring about legal niceties when they started committing felonies. I plugged in her USB. The first audio file was damning my father, explicitly threatening to destroy your pathetic little life if Margaret didn't comply. Daniel's voice in the background, laughing. There's more, Margaret said, pulling out an old address book. Your grandmother had allies, people your parents dismissed as unimportant. She flipped to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. Grace Holloway, obviously, but also Jim Reeves. He was the contractor who built most of your parents' properties. He knows where every corner was cut, every bribe paid to inspectors. Would he testify? After your father stiffed him on his last invoice, he'd probably pay for the privilege. She turned another page. Anna Volkov, your grandmother's friend from the Orthodox Church. She's 91 and sharp as a tack. She helped your grandmother structure her shadow purchases. How did grandmother keep this from them for so long? Margaret smiled sadly. They never thought to look. To them, she was just an old immigrant woman who cooked and kept house. They'd speak freely in front of her, assuming she didn't understand complex financial terms. But Helena had been reading the Wall Street Journal in 3 languages since before your father was born. My phone buzzed. Tom Briggs from Spokane had sent photos of the warehouse properties. They were substantial, much larger than I'd expected. Margaret, look at this. I showed her the images. These aren't just storage units. They're full commercial warehouses. She studied them carefully. The addressing looks familiar. She pulled out her laptop, opened Google Maps. These are all along the proposed light rail extension route, the one the state announced last month. My heart raced. She knew. Somehow, she knew where they'd build. Or she had inside information. Your grandmother cultivated friendships everywhere. City planners, state employees, janitors who cleaned government offices. Margaret's eyes gleamed. She was playing a 30-year game while your parents were thinking quarterly. I stood, energized despite my exhaustion. I need to get to Spokane, today. Not alone. You don't. Margaret grabbed her coat. I'm calling in sick for the rest of the week. Someone needs to watch your back. What about your job? The school board. She pulled out her phone and typed quickly. Just sent my resignation letter, effective end of semester. 28 years of shaping young minds, and I'll be damned if I let your parents' blackmail define my final chapter. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something in Margaret's folder, a business card for Grace Holloway with a handwritten note on the back. When Emily is ready, bring her to me. I have the rest of Helena's pieces. The rest? Margaret nodded. Your grandmother didn't just leave you property and recordings. She left you an entire case, pre-built and ready to file. Grace has been waiting, keeping everything in a trust that your parents can't touch. But she needed you to discover some things on your own first to prove you had the strength to see it through. And if I hadn't, then the whole thing would have been donated to charity upon your 35th birthday. Your grandmother loved you, Emily, but she was practical. She needed to know you could be as ruthless as they are. I thought about the USB drive, the warehouses, the recordings. She was testing me. No, Margaret corrected. She was preparing you. There's a difference. And now, with what you found last night and what's waiting in Unit 17, you're ready for the real fight. As we drove toward Spokane, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, I felt my grandmother's presence stronger than ever. She'd spent decades building this moment, creating an architecture of justice that my parents couldn't see coming. Margaret's phone rang. She put it on speaker. Miss Mitchell, this is Grace Holloway. My sources tell me Mark and Linda just filed paperwork to claim the Spokane properties. We have 72 hours to respond before a judge might grant them temporary control. How did they find out? I started. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you're about to open Unit 17. When you see what's inside, you'll understand why Helena wanted you to find it yourself, and why your parents can never, ever be allowed to access it. The line went dead. Margaret and I exchanged glances. Whatever's in there, she said quietly. It's what grandmother considered her nuclear option. I pressed harder on the accelerator. 72 hours. The clock was ticking, and Unit 17 was waiting. Grace Holloway's office occupied the entire top floor of a historic building in Pioneer Square, its windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay. At 73, she moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd spent 5 decades fighting other people's battles in courtrooms. Your grandmother first came to me in 1992, she said, pouring tea from an elegant silver service. She'd seen your father manipulating the books at his first company. She wanted protection not for herself, but for you. The contents of Unit 17 were spread across Grace's conference table. Margaret and I had driven straight from Spokane, our minds reeling from what we'd discovered. boxes upon boxes of documentation, property deeds, bank statements, photographs, and most devastatingly, original contracts bearing my father's signature on deals everyone believed had been destroyed. "The Waterfront Plaza development," Grace said, picking up one folder. "Your father told investors it failed due to market conditions. In reality, he and Daniel siphoned off $3 million in construction funds. The proof is here: every withdrawal, every shell company transfer, every falsified invoice. How did grandmother get these?" "She had help from someone on the inside, someone your family trusted implicitly." Grace smiled. "Your family's housekeeper, Maria. She's worked for them for 25 years, practically invisible. She photographed documents, recorded conversations, and reported everything to Helena. I thought of Maria, quiet and efficient, always in the background at family events. She's been spying on them this entire time. Not spying, protecting you. Maria's daughter went to college on a scholarship your grandmother secretly funded. Her son's medical bills during his cancer treatment, Helena paid them all. Your grandmother built loyalty through kindness, something your parents never understood." Grace pulled out a thick legal brief. "I've had 5 years to prepare this case. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, blackmail, it's all here. But we needed you to come forward independently to show the court that you discovered this pattern of abuse yourself. Otherwise, they could claim entrapment or undue influence from Helena's estate." "The dinner was the catalyst," I said, understanding finally dawning. "Exactly. By formally disinheriting you in front of witnesses, they created what we call a precipitating event. It gives you standing to investigate, to challenge, to demand full discovery of family assets." Grace's eyes gleamed. "They handed us the very weapon we needed." My phone rang. "Daniel." "Put it on speaker," Grace advised. "Emily." My brother's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to back off. You got the message at dinner. You're out. Stop digging into things that don't concern you." "The Spokane properties concern me," I replied calmly. "Grandmother made sure of that. Those properties are family assets. You forfeited any claim—" "Actually," Grace interjected, "she didn't. I'm Grace Holloway, the Carter estate attorney, Helena Carter's actual attorney, not the puppet your family pays. Every document your father filed yesterday is fraudulent. We have proof." Silence. Then, "You're bluffing." Grace smiled coldly. "Check your email, Daniel. I just sent you a sample page 47 of the Riverside Development audit, the one showing your signature authorizing payment to a non-existent contractor, the account that money went to. We have those records too." The line went dead. "That was risky," Margaret said. "Calculated," Grace corrected. "They need to know we're serious. More importantly, they need to panic. Panicked people make mistakes." She turned to a younger associate who'd been quietly taking notes. "Jennifer, file the injunction to freeze the Spokane property transfer. Then contact Judge Harrison. She owes me a favor. I want an expedited hearing." "How quickly can we move?" I asked. "I've been ready for 5 years. We can file the complete civil suit tomorrow." "But there's something else." Grace pulled out a sealed envelope with my name in my grandmother's handwriting. "Helena insisted you read this before we proceed. Alone." I took the envelope to a small adjacent office. Inside was a single sheet of paper in my grandmother's careful script. "My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, then you have shown the courage I always knew you possessed. But courage alone won't be enough for what comes next. Your parents will not simply accept defeat. They will attack you with everything they have: your reputation, your business, your relationships. They will try to make you the villain of this story. In the safe at Grace's office is one final piece of evidence. I hesitated to use it because it will destroy not just your parents, but Daniel too. It involves a death ruled accidental, but wasn't. Daniel was 17. Your parents covered it up. The choice is yours. You can use the financial crimes to reclaim your inheritance, or you can use everything and ensure they never hurt anyone again. Remember, Mercy is only virtuous when given from a position of strength. You are strong now. All my love. Baba. My hands shook. I returned to the conference room where Grace was waiting. The safe, I said quietly. She nodded, understanding immediately. Are you sure? Show me everything. Grace opened a concealed safe behind a painting. Inside was a police file from 15 years ago. Daniel's best friend in high school had died in a boating accident on Lake Washington. The official report blamed alcohol and inexperience. The real story was different. Witness statements that were never filed. A payoff to the medical examiner. Bank records showing $100,000 transfers to the victim's family the day after they agreed not to pursue charges. Daniel was drunk, Grace explained quietly. He hit his friend with the boat after a fight over a girl. Your parents made it disappear, but Maria recorded their conversations with Richard Blake about the cover-up. Your grandmother kept everything, hoping she'd never need to use it. I stared at the photographs, the reports, the evidence of a life lost and a family's grief purchased. If we use this, Daniel goes to prison. Your parents lose everything. The family name becomes synonymous with scandal. Grace met my eyes. Helena left this choice to you because she trusted your judgment. Margaret took my hand. You don't have to decide now. But I did, because my phone was buzzing with texts from clients canceling contracts, from vendors demanding immediate payment, from employees asking if the rumors were true. My parents had already started their counterattack. How fast can we file everything? I asked Grace. Criminal charges within 24 hours if we include the death. Civil proceedings are already in motion. I thought of all the years of dismissal, the stolen inheritance, the casual cruelty. But more than that, I thought of a 17-year-old boy whose life ended because my family believed money could erase any sin. File it all, I said. Everything. They chose this war. Now they get to lose it. Grace nodded and turned to her team. You heard her. Full scorched earth protocol. By Monday morning, I want every document filed, every agency notified, every media contact briefed. As her office erupted into controlled chaos, I stood at the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline my family had helped build. In 72 hours, we'd tear it all down. The King County Courthouse was packed beyond capacity on that Thursday morning. Word had leaked, Grace made sure of it, and every major news outlet in Seattle had sent reporters. The security guards had to turn people away at 9:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Grace and her team, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. Across the aisle, my parents sat rigid with fury. Richard Blake beside them sweating through his expensive suit. Daniel was notably absent. He'd been arrested at 6 a.m. that morning when the criminal charges were filed. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Harrison. Judge Harrison, a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with obvious distaste for the circus atmosphere. This is a civil hearing regarding the Carter family estate dispute, she began. I want to remind everyone present that I will not tolerate disruptions. Ms. Holloway, you may proceed. Grace stood, every inch the veteran litigator. Your Honor, we're here because Mark and Linda Carter have engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud, embezzlement, and coercion designed to strip their daughter, Emily Carter, of her rightful inheritance. Objection. Blake shot to his feet. These are inflammatory allegations without, Mr. Blake. Judge Harrison cut him off. You'll have your turn. Continue, Ms. Holloway. Grace clicked a remote, and a projection screen displayed the first document. Exhibit A, a transfer agreement created by Mr. Blake at the Carter's instruction, designed to trick Ms. Emily Carter into forfeiting her inheritance. The document references assets that were never legally under Mark and Linda Carter's control. My mother's face had gone pale. My father's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. Exhibit B, Grace continued, clicking to the next slide. Bank records showing systematic embezzlement from Carter family companies. totaling over $7 million over the past 5 years. Money that should have been held in trust for all family members was instead diverted to cover Daniel Carter's failed investments. Your Honor, Blake interjected, may I remind the court that Daniel Carter is not present to defend himself, because he's in federal custody. Grace smoothly interrupted, arrested this morning on charges of manslaughter, conspiracy to commit fraud, and tax evasion. Gasps rippled through the gallery. My mother grabbed my father's arm, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Grace pressed on relentlessly. Exhibit C audio recordings made by Helena Carter, the family matriarch, documenting threats and coercion. She played a clip. My father's voice filling the courtroom. Emily gets nothing. You understand we'll destroy her if we have to. Those recordings were made illegally, Blake shouted. Actually, Grace replied. Washington state allows recording if one party consents. Helena Carter was present for every conversation, making them admissible. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Blake, I'm reviewing your documentation regarding the estate transfer. This signature from Emily Carter acknowledging she has no rights, when was this obtained? At a family dinner last week, Your Honor. A dinner where Ms. Carter was ambushed, emotionally manipulated, and coerced. Grace interjected. She clicked to another slide. Here's the irony. Your Honor, the properties the Carters were trying to steal aren't even theirs. They belong to the Helena Carter Irrevocable Trust, established in 1992 with Emily Carter as the sole beneficiary upon Helena's death. I watched my parents' faces as the truth sank in. All their machinations, their cruelty, their elaborate schemes all for nothing. They'd been trying to steal something that was already mine. There's more, Grace continued. The Carters have been using their daughter's name and credit to secure loans for their failing business ventures, identity theft. Your Honor, federal crime. My father finally stood. This is ridiculous. I'm her father. Everything I've done has been for this family. Including covering up your son's involvement in Timothy Morrison's death, Grace asked quietly. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged her gavel repeatedly. Order, order. When quiet returned, she looked directly at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, the evidence presented here is overwhelming. Not only have you failed to prove any legitimate claim to the disputed properties, but you've also exposed yourselves to serious criminal liability. Richard Blake made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, if I may present evidence of Emily Carter's mental instability. Don't, Judge Harrison warned. I've reviewed your submission, Mr. Blake. A handful of therapy receipts from when Ms. Carter was dealing with family trauma does not constitute mental instability. If anything, it shows remarkable self-care in the face of abuse. She turned to me. Ms. Carter, do you wish to make a statement? I stood slowly, meeting my parents' eyes for the first time since dinner. Your Honor, for 32 years, I tried to earn my family's love. I bent myself into shapes that might please them, accepted their dismissals, forgave their cruelties. But last week, they told me I had no rights in the family I was born into. I pulled out a photograph of my grandmother. Helena Carter came to this country with nothing. She built an empire not through cruelty or manipulation, but through hard work, careful planning, and kindness to others. She saw what my parents were and prepared for this day. I turned to face my parents directly. You said I had no rights. You were wrong. I have every right. The right to my inheritance. The right to justice, and the right to ensure you never hurt anyone again. My mother stood abruptly. You ungrateful Mrs. Carter. Judge Harrison's voice was ice. Sit down or be removed. Grace presented the final evidence, the Spokane properties, now worth $40 million due to the light rail development, the shadow portfolio my grandmother had built, all legally transferred to me. The forensic accounting showing my parents' empire was built on fraud and debt. Your Honor, Grace concluded, we request immediate transfer of all disputed assets to Ms. Emily Carter, a restraining order preventing the Carters from any contact with my client, and referral to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Judge Harrison didn't hesitate. Granted on all counts. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, you are hereby ordered to cease all claims to the Helena Carter estate. Any assets illegally transferred are to be returned immediately. This court also finds sufficient evidence of criminal conduct to refer this matter for prosecution. She looked at Richard Blake. As for you, Counselor, the Bar Association will be very interested in your conduct. I'm recommending immediate suspension of your license pending investigation. Your Honor, Blake stammered, my entire practice. Should have thought of that before committing fraud, she replied coldly. Then, addressing the courtroom, this court has seen many family disputes, but rarely one where the cruelty and criminality were so extensively documented. Ms. Carter, you have the court's sympathy and its full support. As the gavel came down, finalizing the ruling, I felt the weight of 32 years lift from my shoulders. My parents were screaming at Blake, reporters were shouting questions, and Margaret was crying with relief. But all I could hear was my grandmother's voice, speaking Serbian in my memory. Istina će izaći na videlo. The truth had come to light. The Seattle sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson as I walked out of the courthouse, the same colors that had illuminated that fateful dinner just 2 weeks ago. But everything else had changed. The reporters had finally dispersed after Grace's carefully orchestrated press conference. The headlines would run tomorrow. Carter real estate empire collapses in fraud scandal. Prominent Seattle family faces federal charges. Daughter exposes parents' decades of deception. Each word was a vindication my grandmother would never see but had orchestrated from beyond the grave. My phone had been buzzing nonstop, clients expressing support, competitors smelling blood in the water, distant relatives suddenly remembering I existed. I turned it off. There would be time for all of that later. Margaret waited by my car, her face peaceful for the first time in years. How do you feel? Empty, I admitted. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but I just feel hollow. That's grief, she said softly. You're mourning the family you should have had. We drove to the Spokane properties one last time. I needed to see them again, to understand what my grandmother had seen in these industrial buildings along a dusty railroad track. Tom Briggs met us there, holding a manila envelope. Ms. Carter, I held on to this as instructed. Your grandmother said to give it to you only after everything was resolved. Inside was a deed transfer and a letter. The deed was for a small house in the Wallingford neighborhood, the very same style as the one my parents had demolished, but on a quiet street 3 blocks away. The letter was brief. My dearest Emily, I knew they would destroy our first American home, so I bought another. Same year, same builder, same dreams. It's been waiting for you. Make it yours. Build the family you deserve. Baba, Margaret, and I stood in the fading light, looking at the photograph of the house. It was perfect, weathered but solid, neglected but not beyond saving. She knew, Margaret whispered. She knew exactly how this would end. 3 hours later, I stood alone in the empty Bellevue mansion where I'd grown up. My parents were gone, fled to their Mercer Island vacation home while their lawyers scrambled to minimize the criminal charges. The house felt like a mausoleum, every room echoing with the ghosts of what might have been. I found myself in the dining room at that mahogany table where they'd pronounced my disinheritance. The portrait of my grandmother still watched from the wall. I walked over and lifted it carefully from its hook. Beneath it, taped to the back, was another envelope. Inside, a single photograph my grandmother as a young woman in Belgrade, standing beside her own mother, both of them fierce and unsmiling outside what looked like a courthouse. On the back, in Serbian, she'd written, "We are women who survive. We are women who remember. We are women who win." My phone rang. It was Grace. The federal prosecutor just called. Your parents' assets have been frozen pending investigation. Daniel's being held without bail. The Morrison family came forward with new testimony. Richard Blake is trying to cut a deal. offering evidence against your parents in exchange for leniency. Let them devour each other, I said. There's more. The audit of your grandmother's shadow portfolio is complete, Emily. It's worth considerably more than we thought. The Spokane properties alone are valued at $40 million, but there are other holdings. Properties in Portland, investments in tech startups she somehow knew would succeed, art pieces stored in climate-controlled facilities. Total value approximately $170 million. I sat down heavily on the floor. She was rich, really rich, and they never knew. She was more than rich. She was brilliant. Every investment was carefully chosen, every property strategically purchased. She built you an empire while they were busy stealing an inheritance that didn't exist. After Grace hung up, I remained on that floor for a long time, looking at the photograph of my grandmother and her mother, two women who'd survived war, immigration, poverty, and persecution. They'd planted seeds in hostile soil and somehow made them grow. At 11:45 p.m., I drove to the Queen Anne neighborhood where I'd built my design firm. My office was on the third floor of a converted Victorian, with views of the Space Needle and Elliott Bay. I'd thought my parents might try to destroy my business as part of their retaliation, but my clients had stood by me. If anything, the publicity had brought more inquiries. Everyone wanted the designer who'd brought down the Carter Empire. On my desk was a package from Maria, our former housekeeper. Inside was a small Serbian cookbook, handwritten recipes in my grandmother's careful script. A sticky note was attached. She wanted you to have this. Said the secret ingredients were always love and patience. You have both now. I opened to a random page and found my grandmother's stuffed cabbage recipe. In the margins, she'd written, "For Emily, make this when you need to remember who you are." The final document from the court arrived by courier at midnight exactly. The official transfer of the Helena Carter Trust to my full control, $170 million, dozens of properties, and a letter of recommendation from Judge Harrison herself for any future legal needs. My parents would wake tomorrow to federal indictments, frozen accounts, and a reputation destroyed beyond repair. Daniel would spend the next decade, at minimum, in federal prison. Richard Blake would be disbarred and likely imprisoned as well. They'd declared I had no rights. Now they had nothing. I thought about calling them, having one final conversation. But what was there to say? They'd made their choice at that dinner table, just as they'd been making it my entire life, choosing greed over love, choosing Daniel over me, choosing cruelty over kindness. Instead, I drove to my grandmother's grave in the Lakeview Cemetery. It was past visiting hours, but I knew the groundskeeper, another of Helena's quiet allies who'd been slipping me keys for years. I placed the courthouse photograph against her headstone and sat on the damp grass. "You did it, Baba," I whispered. "You saved me from them. But more than that, you showed me how to save myself." The wind rustled through the trees, and for just a moment, I swore I could smell her cooking stuffed cabbage and strong coffee, the sense of survival and love. Tomorrow, I would begin rebuilding, not the Carter Empire of glass and greed, but something better. Something built on the foundation my grandmother had laid, properties that would become affordable housing, investments that would support immigrant families, a trust fund for Maria's grandchildren and the children of every person who'd helped my grandmother document my parents' crimes. But tonight, in this cemetery under the Seattle stars, I simply sat with my grandmother one last time. Two women who'd survived, who'd remembered, who'd won. The truth had come to light. And in that light, I was finally free. Thank you so much for listening to this story of betrayal, justice, and the unbreakable bonds between generations of strong women. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story of Emily's triumph over her family's cruelty moved you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Emily's position? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story.